Some preambles before I begin with the talk proper. So, as has been yesterday very graciously described, somebody described me as a conservationist. I think it's a category error. I am not a conservationist. I have lived long with conservationists. So, sahavasa dosham. I don't have anything other than that to conservation. Neither am I an economist. The closest I have come to being an economist is run several enterprises, been a startup entrepreneur in the world of business, and that's my closest. And in fact, my journey a little bit to set the context for the talk is that over the years, as I did try to sort of bridge these two boats on on two different streams, as you can imagine, massive contradictions appeared, not just in my body, my entire being. So this talk in some sense captures, and I've just thank you guys for the opportunity to kind of capture my thoughts. I've never done this before. This is the first time I'm doing a talk of this kind. So you are both the guinea pigs and the recipients of my collective wisdom or ignorance. So the context is that over years, I kind of experienced a certain degree of discomfort with these two modes of existence. As a cohabitant or inhabitant of the conservation space and my day-to-day work as an entrepreneur in the large world of capitalist businesses. So many ways, this journey that I've taken is my own attempt. So I keep telling everyone that I'm a lapsing capitalist. The process is continuing. I don't know if I'll ever lapse, but this is journey along the way and this is my sharing. I have found in this journey, one thinker, while one has read and thought with many thinkers, I'm the biggest among being the guy with the initials K and M. Sometimes it's a word of abuse, Karl Marx. But I've found the other Karl quite interesting, which is Karl Polanyi. And I shall use Karl Polanyi's way of understanding the capitalist transformation to locate this journey through enterprises of a different sort and try to look at it in a conceptual way. Two parts to the talk. First is a quick tour through my experiences in what I'm beginning to call as eco-social enterprises. This is again, in the world of, did you have to add one more term to a world of labels? I've found this label increasingly useful, and I'll try to justify the fact that it is useful in the course of the talk. Second part of the talk is trying to link this and locate it within the larger theoretical conceptual framework of Karl Polanyi and try to see why that is productive, both from the perspective of further research as well as, more importantly, for somebody like me, from action in the ground. So having got that little preamble out of the way, let me get started. So this we know, I'll breeze through this. I felt important to locate this conversation in that larger context. That the takeaway I want to tell you is the heart of our current planetary predicament is the globe-spanning capitalist economy. And the reason I'm naming it is I think naming is part of understanding, right? What it is, right? It's premised on infinite growth, as all of us know, but on a finite planet. Reminds me of Kenneth Boulding, one ecological economist who says, the only people, and I'll paraphrase him, maybe I'll brutalize what he said, but he said it very elegantly. But the sum and substance of what he said was the only person who can think of infinite growth on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist, right? So having said that and put all the economists in the room on the back foot, let's further. So I think there is for long been a certain hegemonic idea of what is called the economy, right? And I think it's come to a part where it appears and it has been made to appear. And this is a performance which has been going on the global stage for the last 50, one could argue last 500 years, of the emergence of something called the economy, which is actually a particularly specific kind of economy, which is based on a few key characteristics. And to name it again, it's what I call the canonical capitalist economy. The reason I said canonical is this is the idealized idea of the capitalist economy. There are many variants of it, but broadly they share some of these characteristics. Key part of the characteristic which I'd like to kind of focus on is the fact that it is premised on two key things. There's ceaseless commodification. This is this transformation of everything and anything into commodities which can be subjected to exchange, an exchange of a very particular kind, a surplus generating exchange, which then allows you to drive growth in wealth, and accumulation. That accumulation is dynamic, coupled to the fact that there is a particular kind of exchange, and most importantly, that large part of the surplus goes into the coffers of private wealth. So the private ownership of property, profit-driven, surplus-driven markets, and the commodification of anything and everything is what it is, what's really the key features. And, like I said, this has been a hegemonic idea primarily because you can, as Frederick Jameson put it very elegantly, the American theorist and cultural theorist, he said that easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? So this is the classic TINA. There is no alternative, right? That's what it is. Alternative worldviews, however, existed, and this is going to be the point of my entire talk, that, that one has to unveil these things. There is a certain blindness, an intellectual blindness, a certain kind of ontological blindness and epistemological blindness, which refuse to recognize that there is an entire world out there which organizes itself, its social relationships along completely different lines. And that is there right next to us. In the worlds that Keshavji inhabits, Beniji inhabits, our friends inhabit, we inhabit. So part of it is to remove these veils and this insensitivity to the fact that there is an alternative worldview. And of course, where I will try to build my critique and my construction is the kind of atom of this capitalist economy, the capitalist firm or the enterprise. Again, I'm not going to walk through all of these. This is very evident. And this is the kind of enterprises that I lived and breathed and built and consolidated over 20 years, close to 20 years. So this is a side of the coin which one learned as a very natural thing to do, competition and all of that. And it's that canonicity, that received wisdom, that common sense, that, it's in the air kind of thing that I have begun to question. And this is I'll try to share some of those, a little spirit of that journey. There have been alternatives all the way around, right? Both from the perspective of imagining alternative systems and from the imagining from ground up different kinds of enterprises which will constitute that system. So on both these fronts, there have been a variety of them. Some are new, some have been around for a very, very long time, but these are all kind of broad paradigms, ideas, concepts that many of us are familiar with. So again, I'm not going to necessarily go through them. But I think what's happening is very interesting along this side. And this is in the spirit also of kind of looking outside this sense of gloom and doom. These feminist scholars who wrote under this fascinating name, J.K. Gibson Graham, I don't know how many of you have heard of them. Yeah, they wrote this book called Post-Capitalist Politics. But it was very interesting. It was interesting, and they kind of pushed against the bounds of received ideas of academic authorship. Because they constructed this idea, this name called J.K. Gibson Graham. Right? It was Julie Graham and Catherine Gibson. Right? Julie Gibson has unfortunately passed away, but Catherine Graham is still around. So it's a very interesting sort of collaborative exercise under which they wrote. And the idea that they came up with was this need to reimagine and take back the economy. Right? So a lot of this spirit will be in the times of taking back the economy and putting a label on it, which I'm finding quite productive, which is this idea of an eco-social enterprise. And I think it's especially relevant in the context of the reimagining of the economy that we've been trying to do, reimagining the idea of, what are these atoms of economic activity. We all are familiar with social enterprises that explicitly, these are more importantly, they incorporate environmental goals into the organizational designs and missions. These are not just primarily focused only on social benefits. Key goal could be the maintenance and enhancement of natural capital in some instances, even enhancement, what one could call positive externalities, as opposed to the negative externalities many of us are used to hearing about. And most importantly, they tend to be place-based in some form. And we've talked a lot about these things, so of the relevance of place, ये स्थान की जो अहमियत है, यो जिस आर्थिक रूप से स्थान की जो अहमियत है, वो ये these eco-social enterprises try to recover. Right? This again, I'm looking at it as going beyond the canonical enterprise, but constructing the notion of the ideal eco-social. Real-world eco-social enterprise may not fulfill all these criteria, but these are the sort of ideal towards which many strive. They're democratic in many instances in terms of the ownership, not necessarily so. They benefit most importantly from forms of capital which are not subject to market exchange. Right? In our everyday life, there are some forms of capital. They're either knowledge or even money in some instances, even wealth in instances, which is not subjected to the logic of the market. So many of these, goodwill, for instance, right? And give somebody a rate of interest which is below market rate. These to me are all non-market capitals. They're capitals which don't behave or conform to the rules laid out by the market. So a lot of these are part and parcel of an eco-social enterprise. And in many places, they are focused on downshifting the economy. I like this term downshifting because I think it's again very visual. And I think rather than degrowth, which seems to kind of set the cat among the pigeons, downshifting seems to be a more politically correct term, but equally polyvalent, right? So this, in some sense, is and now when I look back from this lens, and maybe I'm overreaching, but please indulge me, because this is the first time I'm trying to put a wrapper around all the diverse experiences that I've had in the last 10 years. But I think there is a very vibrant eco-social enterprise landscape in India. Right? And this is a very diverse one. It scans multiple sectors. It ranges from organizations which are a few years old to those which have been around for multiple decades. There are a variety of structures. Some of them are producer companies, which are farmer fishers. Some are cooperatives. Some are actually privately owned enterprises. They span a huge set of, possible set of legal structures and institutional structures. So I'll, just a pause here to tell you that the next few slides, a couple of slides, I'll just more specifically gesture towards two such experiences I have had, from which some of these learnings and this whole process got catalyzed a little bit. So I'll share that with you. I've been working as part of NCF with the High Altitude Program, with the Changpas, and trying to sort of reimagine the Pashmina economy. So Pashmina, as many of you know who are familiar with Ladakh, is a very product of that part. However, for a very, very long time, Pashmina has always been Ladakh has always been a source of the wool which gives rise to Pashmina. So in other words, the herders and pastoralists were always at the receiving end of a commodity economy. Very, very raw commodity kind of economy. So over the years, there has been a steady effort to value add, one term which all of us know, to the Pashmina economy, starting with local entrepreneurs, local cooperatives. So NCF as a significant stakeholder in that, we jumped in several years ago, almost 7 years ago, and kind of with the support of ICICI as part of the CSR effort, we're trying to reimagine the economy as a collective exercise with all the stakeholders. So there were cooperatives of the pastoralists, the herders were cooperative, there were entrepreneurs from there was government departments. So it was a collective exercise. Primary focus, I would say, come back to the highlights, what we were trying to do and succeeded partially, as many of these complex efforts only allow us to do, improve the capacity of the cooperative. The cooperative we felt was a very, very important structure. It was an institutional structure, a social structure, which was very, very important for the society to be able to capture value locally, right? Which was one of the problems, because most of the value was being captured by traders and merchants outside the system. We also wanted to make sure that this grazing, because Pashmina on the Chinese side and Tibet and places like that, I think Kashmir as it is called, the Chinese have used a completely different method. They took away free grazing. They just put all these goats into typical stall-fed goats. And then, of course, raise the production through the roof. So the hope was that you're not going to make this commodity or this value-added entity so valuable that it will drive that kind of an extractive economy, right? So it was very critical that you promoted it in conjunction, in partnership with the grazers and grazing and herding practices, which were traditionally evolved. And that's one way we felt of keeping checks and balance. Who are the stakeholders in the larger economy of a place? Are they stakeholders who are just from outside, who are not embedded and locally? And I'll come back to this idea of embedding strongly and strongly. I've not used it at all. In the second half, I think I've learned that this idea of notion of embedding is really important, social and ecological embedding. And the whole idea was to embed it socially strongly so that the ecological embedding follows in its wake. So there were a bunch of things which we did. The whole idea was to sort of turn back the dial on commodification. What had happened so far is this entire goat and its wool in the underbelly had become a pure commodity with just the price as its differentiating factor. And dialing back meant bringing back to the wool, re-embodying the wool in the landscape. So that was the act of decommodification. How did one do it? You did stories around this. You built the fact that this is not just any other wool. It happens at these high altitudes. It happens through this particular process, that there is overwintering of the goats, and that there are all these pastoralists who take it, herders who take it to these high altitudes, get through the winter. So you bring back some of that sort of place into the product. Right? So these were many stories that, through little movies, through kind of blog posts, through local storytelling, through local sort of events, one tried to bring this back. Most important was, of course, create this platform. I'm not going to say that this is been incredibly successful. It's an ongoing process. These are stakeholders with very different kinds of politics. So I think this is a learning experience of bringing this whole kind of economy in this place. And most importantly, I think the idea was, can one increase the share of value? In other places, can you bring back the economy? Can you work with the local pastoralists to take back the Pashmina economy? Like, that was the key, right? So I think it's a journey. It's on its way. It's been an extraordinary place for learning. And the other is a diametrically different experience. I have been associated with this coffee company called Black Bazaar Coffee, extraordinary founder called Arshia Bose, who incidentally is a geographer. I don't know what it is with geographers and starting companies. There seem to be many of them around, Cambridge geographers particularly. But this whole idea was, there was this coffee, especially in South India and peninsular India, had found itself at this interesting juncture. That there was a transition from it being a subsistence crop for many to becoming a global commodity, subject to many of the vagaries of the global commodity dynamic. Crashes and fluctuations and things like that, which small growers find and smallholders find. Key goals for Black Bazaar Coffee was to enable smallholder coffee growers to secure a stable livelihood. So this was the social purpose. Strengthen farming practices that conserve biodiversity. So this was all shade-grown coffee in, the deciduous forests of the Western Ghats. So this is very critical that the local biodiversity was not affected by improvement in the coffee dynamics, coffee production. Now, of course, it had to be profitable. So that I will not again say that thing at all. So this was a private enterprise set up by an entrepreneur, but it was evolved around, it sort of built around this idea that shade-grown coffee allows for ecological complexity. So it's about coexistence of a commodity crop with the ecology of the place. And the fact that shade-grown coffee was recognized as a value-added product, that people recognized value to a shade-grown coffee, was an interesting segue, an interesting door to open and explore in the process of decommodification, right? So that's been an interesting, part of this whole journey. It's continuously partnered efforts. The idea is to work very, very closely with the local growers to contextualize this idea of improvement, and not like a large corporate entity which comes and more or less delivers these as key requirements which have to be fulfilled from the perspective of quality, but you evolve these growing practices over time. And hopefully this kind of partnership creates some kind of a knowledge commons which then can be shared by anybody. It's not something which Black Bazaar lays ownership on. It's not unique IP, it's not patented, or it's not copyrighted and protected in that way. So other part of the whole thing is celebrating this form of farm to cup kind of journeys. Disintermediating people, this is another big part of the whole journey. Some of these, which is, and I'll come back to it, is I think what the current global economy is built around is very complex and anonymized supply chains. The commodity goes through steps and places which the end consumer has no idea of. But that was one big part of the decommodification story here. Bring the coffee drinker close to the coffee grower, right? And peel off that layers of anonymity. Now, I'll quickly go over this part. It's so the eco-social enterprise, when you cast this gaze, many large organizations, and I'm not going to delve into detail, many people in the audience here will be aware. Some might question my choice of calling some of these eco-social, but we can get into that. It's a bit of semantics, but I've taken a little bit of a poetic license here, looking at this term and cast them into that. They broadly fulfill the criteria of the ecosystem. These are large, these have been around for a long time, they're growing in their own fashion, right? Now, what has caught my attention in the last few years, and this is like really gives you, Like Asmita was saying, some of these are inspiring. These small startings. And in some sense, I will try to, appropriate them for a particular narrative that I'm building. That these indeed are a form of new politics, right? That this is a whole bunch again. I mean, for those of you who are interested, one should definitely go. These are small enterprise. This is very selective, very subjective. I'm no means judging or qualifying any of these. This is just a, quirky, sort of subjective selection of enterprises, which I find really interesting and which seem to be doing fairly subversive work in some instances. I'm not going to go into the process of naming all of these, but, hopefully this presentation will be shared. I encourage all of you to kind of go and look at these, and I'm sure you'll discover in your search many others which are related to it. Yeah. So if you look at this, then you expand the gaze a little bit, then you see that there are actually well-established kind of entities like these across the world, right? This is not just of course not in India, and in some places, large parts of the world. In fact, I've tried to be selective here and looked at those from multiple places. This Fairphone is an incredible company. I wish phones were available here. This is entire supply chain of components are fair trade based and based on their ability to stay. In fact, these guys encourage repair of the phones rather than, so this whole idea of obsolescence built into it is the exact opposite of what they do. Very, very interesting company. I won't go into specifics of all these. Mountain Hazelnuts is a kind of intriguing entity. It has its own slightly stressful sides, but I thought it kind of broadly fits into this. None of these are sans their tensions. I'll come back to it at the end. This is not by any means a neat category, the eco-social enterprises. It's inhabited the space, as you can imagine, with all kinds of contradictions, all kinds of tensions, and the possibility of counter politics, right? So it's not all rosy picture, but it's a set of possibilities. So now if you look at it, go from here, I'll now jump into my little tryst with Polanyi, right? For the sort of card-carrying sociologists and economists in the audience, I seek indulgence. But I will try to justify why I think Polanyi is a useful thinker to think through this. So I find his work very intriguing, having had one's tryst with Marx over time, found that route to come here. For those of you who don't know, Polanyi was a very interesting, influential Austro-Hungarian economic anthropologist, sociologist, and philosopher at one level. His seminal work is The Great Transformation, published in 1944. Interesting thing about Polanyi's sort of personal biography, he fought a continuous battle with academia. And it's only at the end of his life he finally got an academic appointment, and it turned out his wife, who's an extraordinary character, also was a card-carrying communist. And this was the time of the early 40s and a few years before the McCarthy years in America, and she was not allowed to enter America. So Polanyi did this interesting cross-border travel. He lived in Canada with his wife in a place called Pickering in Ontario, and he would make the journey every day to come and teach at Columbia, right? So fascinating personal biography, bridging boundaries, disciplines, sometimes politics, right? So Canada was more tolerant. Anyway, coming back to Polanyi's key arguments, he said, he particularly very articulately showed, this whole contention was that then markets are not natural. That's what we are all told. This is our truck and barter is our standard, right? That the Smithian notion of truck and barter, right? We are all born to truck and barter. But what conflating that simple behavioral predilection into markets was a leap of faith, which many of these classical economists took, right? So what he said is markets as institutions, which we think are not at all natural. They have to be brought into being. They have to be supported. It's a social construct. It has to be evolved through social and political processes. It disrupts traditional social disruption. In fact, it's born, the market relationships are set up only after dismantling a certain set of existing social. A new kind of rationality, a new kind of logic comes in. That was Polanyi's contention. Economic processes were historically embedded. What was economic? Was historically embedded inside social relationships, whether they be of caste, class, whatever you call it, local customs, as we see in many other economies around the world around us, and that the forced transformation of fundamental human and natural. Underlying this whole dynamic that Polanyi identified was this urge to commodify and create what he said were fictional commodities. That is, objects or ideas or concepts which did not naturally lend themselves to be commodified in the form of a neatly sellable product, which is, land, labor, and money. And the only way this could arise is through an act of disembedding. So you have to extract these away from their social relationships, which is the natural state they are in, to create them and mobilize them to be able to move around inside the market. That is Polanyi's contention, right? My understanding of it, at least. Now, this idea I found, this is the most powerful notion. The way Polanyi articulated is this disembedding is naturally associated, he said, with a kind of re-embedding, which emerges as an endogenous dynamic from within society, right? And he called this dialectical movement, the double movement, right? This is Polanyi's conceptualization. So market economy's attempt to create an autonomous economic sphere and characterized by commodities and free exchange, but society inherently resists this complete commodification, and it's this resistance which is the reverse movement of re-embedding, reappropriating back into society, and I'll come to another part. Polanyi's initial formulation did not explicitly account for nature. In fact, the only nature he brought in is through a little bit of the back door, which is gesturing towards the idea of land, which was powerful enough, but it didn't quite conform to our idea of ecology and nature. And there is an entire field of scholarship, what one could call neo-Polanyian, right? New Polanyi, so, right? Which is trying to think of saying that this attempt to commodify nature is also an attempt to create fictitious commodities. So, in other words, the neo-Polanyians claim that the Polanyian framework is broad enough and wide enough to incorporate this disembedding, this ecological disembedding, which we are witnessing as part of the larger planetary crisis. Yeah? So, nature is a fictitious commodity that cannot be fully reduced. And this is not an extraordinarily original statement. This is something which has been said by Neil Smith, many other people, right? Noel Castry, then many others, David Harvey, and many geographers have actually alluded to the idea of nature being commodified. Now, what is important to understand in this Polanyian idea of disembedding is what this disembedding does. As with social processes which leads to fragmentation, it leads to a kind of disruption of ecological dynamics. This attempt to extract, either through extraction or through financial valuation, when you take away a piece of nature, quote unquote, even to make it a piece, how do you even take nature away, right? And so this, in this Polanyian scheme, the ecological services and that environment, that whole idea would be a form of disembedding, embedding. So it's an interesting question to ask, right? So this ecological re-embedding is a critical component of the dialect. Now the leap of faith that I'm making, and I'm not alone, when I say I'm reading a few scholars and finding in violent agreement with them, right? So this is part of what I'm channeling. And, I didn't necessarily use references here because I can share these with this. So ecosystem seem to embody Polanyi's vision of reconnecting in their ideal form, right? Since this is in the spirit of conceptualizing and theorizing, I'm not subjecting it to a theory testing mode of exactly subjecting every single enterprise. I'm sure every single enterprise that I listed by that definition will fail, right? But the question really to ask is, are they approximating this idea of re-embedding? And my argument would be yes. They fundamentally challenge the pure market strategy that all enterprises and all economy has to be based on market exchange, right? Creating alternative economic organizational structures, not just privately owned companies and privately owned entities where shareholder value is what is maximized, right? Reintegrating economic activities into broader social contexts. So there is a continuum between what is the economic and what is the social and what is the ecological. So shade-grown coffee. The fact that the shade is not just abstract object, but it is a set of species which have a very specific set of identities and very specific set of life history characteristics, and the local ecology, very critical to the idea of the shade, right? So in some sense, ecological re-embedding. Potentially, I see these as seeds of the future, not yet plants and trees, but potentially seeds, right? What is germinating here is an interesting idea. Why do I see that? Many of these treat land as a heritage. They prioritize long-term community stewardship as opposed to privatized ownership, right? They definitely, at one level or the other, challenge these growth paradigms, right? However, huge challenges exist, right? And I'm coming to the end of my talk. I'll open this up. So this is, I think it's important to pay pressure. This is where the re-embedding processes get resistance from the deeply embedded dynamics. So for instance, economic pressures and competition. So you still have to survive as a firm in a market when others are not subjecting themselves to the same strict criteria. For them, externality is a negative. For you, the externality is a positive. So it's almost like running a race with your legs tied. Right? You're competing for honey or coffee in a market in which somebody is not burdened by these necessities, these dual imperatives or triple imperatives. Right? And there are all kinds of economic pressures. You need funding. And you're a firm. How do you distinguish yourself from somebody else who is also trying to raise money? Because all firms need support. So there's a whole range of these problems which one can think of as economic pressure and competition. Systemic and institutional barriers. These species are unknown. The regulatory kind of hurdles are sometimes overwhelming. For a small eco-social already carrying this burden of ecology and society on it, not this lean, mean fighting machine, which is the capitalist, the canonical capitalist enterprise. Not burdened by anything, right? Except check marks on a pollution control board certification. So it's an extraordinarily difficult kind of set of things to overcome. The institutional barriers. These institutions are, unknown. What is the structure? Where is the ownership? Who will own what? Where is accountability? So people have very fundamental questions of how they are organized, right? When you come into. So this liminal space, as one of the scholars in this area, Nadia Yohannsova says, there is this liminal space, this ill-defined space between the for-profit world and the not only for-profit world. This is a very intriguing space, So there are these identity issues coming. And most importantly, how to maintain this identity over time. Is it possible to do this? Many of these institutions have challenges. For instance, Selco, one of these big enterprises which are called ecosystem, they've had significant challenges from financial investors. Because this was a solar power company which invested in trying to rural solarification and brought a lot of solar power. But as the private investors came, they started questioning the nature of the model. And they were owners. So these are very interesting dynamics. Internal challenges. Because these are new forms of organizations, often very, very entrepreneur-driven or just institution-driven. How do you build robustness in your operations? How do you build quality in your operations? So internal challenges are massive. Right? There are large conceptual research gaps. I'll address that separately as, where do you locate? Right? It's a really interesting challenge. You try and locate some of these entities. And that's a part which I will spend the last few minutes of my talk on, and then I will need to cheat a little bit because that is where I make some calls. And, I like to share that with you because my interest in some sense is that of a researcher. So if you look at the research, there's a whole bunch of these, challenges which emerge from conceptual. There's a lack of research and understanding the specific needs of entrepreneurs who try to incorporate green principles. Need for much more systematic. Actually, existing research focuses on macroeconomic needs, right? There's a lot of non-monetized important aspects to their economy. So this is again not completely understood, right? There is biggest challenge I feel is to even put this wrapper around them and call them eco-social enterprise. The larger identity question is what should qualify as a research enterprise, right? So there are some intermediate and a variety of social factors, which is most people are not aware of these entities. When you're a coffee company or a honey company or a cheese company, and you wear these credentials, how do you kind of sensitize your consumer about the fact that the value chain, that the chain this comes to, is a profoundly different chain? And that has a certain other social imperative and ecological imperative. So that's a big problem. And the other part is, at the end of the day, overcoming consumer behavior is a challenge. And so, but having listed out some of these challenges and sort of alluding to the fact that this is not really a mystery, I really draw my inspiration from is, I think, this in sort of, the community economics language, the J.K. Gibson brand language. These are genuinely initiatives to take back the economy, re-own it, bring it back into spaces which it was not supposed to be part of, right? Into those liminal spaces of the household, of the community,
of the commons and all those places, which basically we were told were not rightful places to locate or invite. So I think I find that incredibly inspiring. Second, I think people are, as a marketer society, I feel there is increasing recognition of a slightly more sensitized consumption, more responsible consumption. Many of these have growing customer base, nothing like the lot kind of things, but I think these are seeds, as I say. So, in some sense, large gaps remain in terms of what needs to be done, and this is my concluding slide. From a broader research perspective, I've kind of very idiosyncratically identified a few areas. I particularly am interested in the linkages this allows to other paradigms like degrowth, the diverse economies kind of paradigm, and the commons. But of course, there is an extraordinary set of very fertile, rich areas for research to be done. But I'm particularly interested in the work on the ground. This is something as an entrepreneur of a different kind which interests me, is how does one create the conditions to allow for the continued existence of these kind of things. I think I've listed out a few of them, but these are areas where one needs to put shoulder on the wheel. I think these are hard problems. But what is again very heartwarming is that there is an increasing consensus. May not be somebody who will agree with my articulation of this problem like this, and identify completely with the politics of this whole thing, but I think these need to be allowed to perform themselves into existence.